The reading is from John 10, starting at verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. A hired hand will run away when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks them and scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep and they know me, just as my Father knows me and I know the Father. So I sacrifice my life for the sheep. I have other sheep too that are not in this sheepfold. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd. The Father loves me because I sacrifice my life so I may take it back again. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. For I have the authority to lay it down when I want to, and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded. When he said these things, the people were again divided in their opinions about him. Some said, he's demon-possessed and out of his mind. Why listen to a man like that? Others said, this doesn't sound like a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you very much. Right. Morning. And for many of you who I have never seen before, Happy New Year. I reckon you can still say Happy New Year until Easter. And then after that, you have to say something else. Okay, just bear with me now. So, hello to all of those who I've never seen before and to those who I've seen before. My name is Bola. John was going to give me a lovely introduction, I'm quite sure of that, but I'll give you mine instead. I've been a member here of St. Mary's for quite a long time. I'm not here on Sundays because I'm a priest and I work in a prison, so normally on Sundays I'm in chapel working with a bunch of guys. And yeah, today my colleague is taking the service because he likes doing services once a month while I get to do the remaining 3. But it's all good. Now, I have a confession to make. I love preaching. I really do. I love it. I get nervous. I get kind of crazy when I'm prepping, but I still do. The thing I like about it is that it gives me a chance to go back to the text and to read deeper than I normally would, sort of like everyday Bible reading. And when Sally asked me to do this, I confess, I didn't really think twice about it. I just said yes. And then I started reading it, and then I was like, oh, why do they always give me the hard ones to do? They never give me the easy ones. Because I read this and I thought, I don't really know what it is I'm supposed to be saying here. So there's this old worship song, I don't know if you know it, it's The Lord's My Shepherd, it's by Stuart Townsend. And the interesting thing, well, for me about the song is that it has a female chorus. So in prison, I'm usually the only person singing the female chorus, where all the other men are singing the main words. And I like this song because we try every possible method we can to get scripture into the lives of this man, to get them familiar with it. So we're always looking for things that help them to just encounter God and encounter scripture and encounter all the different ways in which you can help them to meet Jesus. And when I was thinking about this, I thought, oh, maybe this is more kind of Psalm 23-ish, and maybe this is more kind of David Shepherd King-ish, because Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd. And then I just really had to admit the truth that as a 21st century citified person, I haven't got a clue what a shepherd is. So I haven't got a clue what a good shepherd is even supposed to look like. So I thought, right, let's do the responsible thing. Let's do an archaeological deep dive. Let's go back, find out what shepherds were like in first century. And yeah, there's a lot of information out there. I'm not sure how much of it is accurate, but it was helpful because the one thing it made me realize is I still know nothing about shepherds. But when I was preparing, I suddenly had this kind of eureka moment when I was sort of reading through one of the commentaries. And it was a eureka moment about a word I received about 22 years ago when I was at New Wine. Yeah, and I was still able to tolerate camping. I am now at that age where I can't be bothered to tolerate camping. But I held on to this word, even though I didn't understand it. And sorry, for those of you who New Wine is just this whole, you don't know what that means. It's a place where Christians gather together for 5 days for sort of worship and teaching and stuff, and as in case you haven't figured out, camping. And it can be a brilliant experience if you manage to do it during a time where it doesn't rain, cats, dogs, and every other horse in the Noah's Ark thing. I mean, camping is the first place I came across sandbags, just to give you an idea. But it can also be a place where you encounter God powerfully. And this is what basically happened to me during the years that I used to go to New Wine. I would just have these amazing encounters with God. And this particular year, I had this word that was just reverberating in my head. It kept going, keeper of the door, keeper of the door, keeper of the door, keeper of the door. The whole worship, and I'm thinking, what the heck is a keeper of the door? And I kid you not, I asked everyone, and no one had an answer. And I kept asking year after year after year, and then eventually I stopped asking, but I keep the word because, I don't know, I just kept the word. And I'm sharing this today because I think it's kind of important that we acknowledge that when we're reading the Bible that we're deficient. We're deficient because we're 21st century people reading a word set in a context that's first century. And we need to have that, if you like, pair of spectacles on where we go, right, 21st century off, first century on. And try as much as possible for us to encounter the text in its context. So like I said, the penny dropped and I realized there was more at play than I had ever considered before. And last week, the amazing, I have such love for her, Sasha, who did my reading just now, spoke brilliantly about Jesus being the gate to true life, wholeness, and freedom, and all those values that make us truly human and make us truly in the image of God. And you know, I love listening to Sasha. I really do. I mean, she blows my mind. And I love listening to her testify about Jesus. There's such truth that comes out of her when she does this. I especially love the bit where she said, we don't need to listen to other people in the world. We only need to listen to God to tell us who we are. And I can't tell you how many times I've shared that particular message in prison. When I'm speaking to men who regularly hear the worst about themselves, when I'm speaking to men whose lives and identities are encapsulated within their illegal and wrong actions. Who do we say we are? And another way of looking at this is to say, who do you agree with when it comes to your identity and when it comes to what is the question of a good life? What does a good life look like? And again, I've had to point this back to my men when I'm talking to them on Sunday, because they, it seems to me, live in some kind of alternative world just adjacent to ours, where they have different ethics and values, different ways of understanding what's allowed and what's not allowed. For example, the weight these men give to the concepts of respect and snitching just does not exist in my culture. I don't have that same weight for respect. I don't have that same weight for snitching. In fact, I don't think I ever used the word till I started working in prison. It's just not my thing. And yet, for these guys, it's everything. They live in a culture that I struggle to see into because I've refused to give in to that culture just so that I can gain access to it. I think we give agreements to the places that we find ourselves living in. In other words, we give consent to cultures that try to define us when we choose not to stand apart from those definitions. We give consent even when we don't say yes or no because we have not chosen to stand apart. So for some of my guys, being a snitch is worse than being a bad dad. And it's clear to me in prison ministry means setting people free, but it also means confronting the definitions that they've consented to. So let's have a quick look at the text, which is from John chapter 10. And so I'm about to start preparing, and then the first thing I hit, because this commentary guy is telling me, his name is Colin Cruz, he's Australian, and he's arguing that I can't understand John chapter 10 unless I read John chapter 9. And I'm just thinking, I don't have time for this, love. I need to do John chapter 10. I don't want to add a second chapter to it. So I go, all right, be diligent, go read 9. And 9 is the story about this man who's born blind, and the disciples kind of go to Jesus, oh, this man, he's born blind. What's the problem? Whose fault was it? Was it his sin? Was it his parents' sin? Because that's how people thought then. That was the cultural understanding of the day, that a congenital affliction has to be a result of sin. And we know that it's not not just the disciples who thought like this, but also the leaders, because if you read further in John 9, they throw out this accusation at this man when he's talking to them, and they say, you were born in utter sin, that's who you are. Jesus, in response to the disciples' questions, whose fault is it, changes the perspective from fault-finding to opportunity-seeking. He challenges the prevailing thought that this is not about anyone's sin, but rather this is about, let's see what God can do with this. Let's move away from the blaming and shaming, and let's see what happens when we invite God in. Let's change how we look at this. Let's change the conversation around this. Let's change the definitions around this. So then he heals the blind man, and oh my gosh, what a commotion this causes. I mean, the whole of John chapter 9 is about this one act. Because the neighbors react, the religious leaders react, everyone has something to say. The poor man is pulled back and forth. And then it comes down to a few questions. Again, who are we? Who is God? Who is Jesus? That's what's going on here in this chapter. Because the religious leaders there, they're focused on the rules. Their cultural understanding of the day, their cultural understanding is this is how things should be done. Therefore, this is who this person is. And for them, because Jesus has healed on a Sabbath, that action can't be from God. This absolutely amazing, miraculous act, can't be from God, because you know what? You did it on the Sabbath. You needed some mud. You put it on the guy's eyes. That is clearly not the right way of doing things. So some of the leaders are like, nope, this guy's wrong. And the other leaders are like, I don't know. I mean, his action is wrong, but how could he have done this amazing miracle? They're still not willing to concede. The man who can now see his parents are called up as witnesses. The parents are terrified because they know that if they stand up for the man, they run the risk of being canceled by their community. So they plead the proverbial fifth. And they're like, you know what? Our son's old enough to give evidence for himself. So why don't you just ask him? And the guy who can now see steps up and he says, well, look, I don't know whether or not the person who healed me is a sinner or not. All I know is I can now see. And Cruz, this theologian, he's arguing that you cannot read John 10 without reading John 9, because John 10 is all about Jesus' response to the current state of leadership in Jerusalem at the time. That this is not just a pastoral allusion. He's saying something cutting, something challenging in the I am declarations. And actually, when you go back and look at some of the stuff in the Old Testament, for instance, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, you can see what this argument is talking about. Jeremiah 1 says, woe to those shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. Ezekiel 1 says, son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. And that's what Jesus is doing. So when we read John 10 and we read Jesus' word on being a good shepherd, we should hear those echoes of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We need to see that aspect of the rebuke of leadership that's taking place. But there's something else that's taking place here. Because Jesus is not just saying good leadership is about breaking religious rules. There's something else happening. And again, I have to go back to John 9 when it says verses 3 and 4, and I'm paraphrasing from the translation. When the disciples ask, whose fault is this, that this man is like this? And Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents are sinning or sinned. But so that God's work can be revealed in him, I need to do the work of him who sent me while I can. So that God's work can be revealed. Not his situation is like this so that God can do it. He's saying, no, that's the wrong question. Let's stop asking those questions. You see, leadership in the image of God looks for opportunities to bring about God's continual interaction with the needs of his people. This is what is going on in the Good Shepherd. A good shepherd, a good leader, calls the people out to where God is, safeguards them, and is all about encountering God's saving grace that we might have life to the full. It's not just a pastoral analogy, which I am very grateful for because, like I told you, I know nothing about shepherds and sheep. But I understand leadership, and I love this idea that leadership is about looking for God opportunities. I think it's an amazing, awesome perspective to take in life. I want to be that person who is constantly looking at life in this way, looking for opportunities, for God opportunities to encounter the suffering of his people, or the needs of his people, or even just the joy of his people. And today, in my workplace, I find myself regularly challenged because my perspective is usually rage and frustration. Because all I see is the brokenness of a society. I'm frustrated by the lack of options for my men when they're released. I'm frustrated by the just general, what it seems to be is no one wants to be accountable, and no one wants to own up, and no one wants to stand up and put their head above the parapet. And no one thinks that my men are worth it. So I'm reading this, and I have to realize that this challenge is for me as well. That I need to change my perspective, that I need to stop looking with rage and start to look with opportunity. You see, if we look at John chapter 10, where it says, the hired hand is not a shepherd and does not own the sheep. I need to stop focusing on the hired hands. I need to focus on he who owns the flock. I need to remember that the lack of leadership I'm frustrated by, I'm looking in the wrong place for it. I need to change where I look. So Jesus, as a good shepherd, is a pointed and radical challenge to ask ourselves, where do we stand and who do we follow and where do we look for help? It challenges us on how we respond to brokenness in society, how we respond to the manifested ravages of the fall. Because that man being born blind, that's all about the fall. It calls us out of our existing identities. In verses 1 to 6 of John chapter 10, the shepherd is calling for the sheep to follow him into pasture. He's calling them out of small family compounds, and as he's calling them, the doorkeeper opens the door to the shepherd for the sheep to come out. I was like, oh, there it was all along. That's what a doorkeeper does. Jesus is the door to the pastoral enclosure. When you move to 7 to 10, he's changed. What happens is that between verses 1 to 6 and verses 7 to 10, there are two separate stories. One is set in the city, when the shepherd comes knocking on the door and the doorkeeper opens and then sends the sheep out. The second is set in the countryside where Jesus is the gate. So he's saying different things. He's adding, if you like, he's layering to his point. So he's the door to the pastoral enclosure where you go into that wide open space filled with life and all the things that we need to grow and flourish, like Sasha was talking about last week. Then you come to verses 11 to 13, and he's the shepherd who will die for the sheep. And let's be honest, he's taken this pastoral device way beyond its use. Because if you're a shepherd and you die, ultimately your sheep remain defenseless. So why are you dying for your sheep? What Jesus is doing is he's taking that shepherd leader context and he's just taking it apart. He's turning it on its head. And you might be wondering, where is he going? You have to follow him all the way to 14 to 18, when he says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. My sheep know me in the same way the Father knows me and I know the Father. There's a shift that's taking place. And that shift is on the pasture. That shift is the pasture, is the relationship between the Father and the Son. This is the pasture that we're being called into, the relationship between the Father and the Son. This is where we find life and life to the full. It is in this relationship of complete trust and intimacy that we're being called into as the flock. That's the new destination. It's a shift because in first century Judea, pasture would have been connected to the concept of a free homeland. But in first century Rome, when the church is hearing this, the homeland is gone. So what are they hearing? You have a new home. You have a new place. And that place is very much located in love and intimacy and trust. This is where the good shepherd is leading you to. A place where you encounter the unyielding, transforming love of God the Father towards the Son. And we are entering into that space. And as we choose to enter into that space, we see more clearly. Our perspectives do change. We're no longer blind. We now see. This is a place, this pasture challenges and encourages us to say, look at the world differently, look at Jesus differently, look at yourself differently. And then again, you come to verse 17 and 18, and Jesus is not done with just breaking our minds with his pastoral devices that no longer work. He says, this is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so I might take it back again. No one takes it from me. I lay down of my own free will. I hear these words, and I hear something I haven't heard before. I hear consent. Now, consent can be very loaded, but if we strip it back to its basic, it's just this: agreement. And what on earth has this got to do with Jesus being a good shepherd? Or how does it even fit into this political context we've been talking about? How does it fit into leadership? How does it fit into the relationship between the Father and the Son? And again, we have to go back to John 9. Because you see, when we get to the aftermath of the healing of the blind man, the religious leaders are trying to force an agreement on not only who Jesus is, but how God works and what his kingdom looks like. They're trying to say this is the only way you can see it. That's the confrontation that's taking place. And they are asking that man, and they're asking us, will we follow the prevailing culture of the day, or will we follow this rabble-rousing, law-breaking person who claims to be of God? Where is our consent? Where's our agreement going? You see, when the sheep follow the shepherd, they give consent to his will. They agree, we're going to give ourselves into your hands. If sheep could talk. When they stay in the pasture, they're saying, yes, we agree, you will protect us. When Jesus lays down his life, he says to the Father, I agree. I know you have complete and utter love for me. I trust you. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to lay my life down, trusting that you will bring me back to life. In that consent is a concept of utter trust and intimacy. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own knows me. Do we, though? Do we really know him? There's a difference in consenting to an ideology and consenting to Jesus. One is a concept, a bunch of rules, a historical understanding, prevailing culture, a practice. The other is a person, a real divine person who invites us to enter into his risen life. And where in that risen life we meet again the love of the Father and the Son. And as we enter into that, we are bathed in it, we are broken by it, and we're reformed and renewed. We enter into this invitation blind because we have no idea what's going to be on the other side. The first time I visited a prison, I was exploring chaplaincy options. I absolutely hated it, and I told myself, never. I will never work in a prison. I think about that, and I think about how many times I've withheld full consent from Jesus, how many times I've just not trusted him enough for my life and for my future. Because I did not know what was ahead. And it's natural. You just don't sometimes. And I have to, again, remind myself, where am I? Have I given you full consent, Lord? Have I said I'm in full agreement with whatever it is that you want to do with me? Take me and use me, not just here I am. So I want to end by asking the following questions. From the text, I have to ask you this. Is there a thief climbing over your wall? Do you feel that there's something in your life it doesn't feel like you have a choice? You hate it, you don't want it to be there, but you just feel you don't have a choice about it. When I talked about being a doorkeeper, did that make any sense to you? Are you called to be someone of influence? Are you called to be someone who calls people out, who opens the door to Jesus? Are you struggling to see yourself in that way? Does any part of your life feel that at any moment you could be abandoned, left high to dry, left to take the fall? Do you think maybe you have put your trust in the wrong place? Have you given yourself over to the hired hands? And finally, do you want to know the true pasture? That relationship of intimacy between Jesus and the Father, a relationship of complete trust. Do you want to know this place? Such a relationship of complete trust and intimacy takes time. But the good news is that this is a relationship we're called to stand in. So in a moment, there will be an opportunity to respond in prayer. So I want to leave you with this. Listen deeply. The shepherd's call is for everyone. It's a call to a new perspective. It's a call to bring our consent to his adventure. It's an invitation to journey into ultimate love, the greatest relationship destination there is. So, come.